Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for our participant, our audience this morning. I know it's 8:30 in the morning, and yesterday was a day full of very interesting session and a nice event. I hope all of you enjoyed the concert last night and entertainment. My name is Francesca Recanatini. I'm a lead economist at the World Bank, and I'm simply the moderator today on this panel. We have three colleagues that are here. They're going to share their experience and their work, and I have come across since we have decided to have this panel. Several other colleagues have reached out to me and shared their interest, their work. So I'm getting a sense that there will be a very lively conversation this morning because there is much more that is happening around this topic than actually we have been discussing. And I really hope we will have about half an hour at the end of our remarks and to take question, answer, comments, and thoughts. So just to set the stage, I'm sharing here a couple of definitions of sextortion because there is a lot of different debate and comments and different idea what it is. And I think that is important to actually have a common understanding of what we think. In general, sextortion is a form of gender corruption and is very much an abuse of authority where what is the transaction is sexual favor. And this has very profound implication both for those that are victim of this type of crime and also for those that perpetrate this crime. And I wanted to have the opportunity today to actually think a little bit more about what has been done and what could be the potential policy implication. And especially thinking, should we think differently of what we could be doing when we are trying to reduce the risk of sextortion in terms of policy? Because you can imagine that some of the traditional tools that we have and that we use to reduce the risk of other forms of corruption might not be the most appropriate and relevant for a form of corruption like sextortion. So I'm sharing this. This is something that I started to put together by myself when I first came across sextortion, and this is based on the work and the data collected through the Global Barometer. And what was striking to me was that the numbers, and I work on corruption for over the past 25 years, and only recently I really started to focus on the frequency and the extent of this problem and how I take a full responsibility. I hadn't focused enough on this. I hadn't really thought about how frequent it could be. Now, we have three panelists that have really focused on this problem and trying to collect the data and reflect on what could be done in terms of sextortion, what could be the potential reason, causes, extent, and what could be the policy implication. We're going to not have a traditional presentation, but rather have a more of a question and answer with us, and then question from you from the floor. Basel our colleague Hazel, I have known her for a long time when she was still at Global Integrity, but she's a program director now for Latin America at the Institute of War and Reporting, and Peace Reporting, and she is actually one of the lead author of a report on sextortion that she will talk about it. Otrun is actually a postdoc and a professor now at the UN-MERIT and has done significant work and research on sextortion, especially in specific sector. And Claudia is a colleague from the Basel Institute who has really, with their team, they have been focusing on how sextortion has caused an implication for community and women and in different countries around the world. So let me start with, and I apologize, we discovered yesterday at the panel that I had yesterday evening that the sound can be a challenge in this room. So I will advise our speaker to speak up so everybody can hear them. So let me start with Hazel. In 2020, you actually had, and I'm going to pass the clicker to you so you can have your presentation. You actually led the preparation of this report on understanding sextortion. Can you give us a sense of what were the main finding that you had and some of the most surprising, actually, result doing this work that you led? Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the invitation. I actually thought that we had to have PowerPoint presentations, so I will use some of those when they come up. But to start with your question about the report, this was in 2020, so I imagine and hope that some things have evolved since then. This was a report that Transparency International was very interested in doing, and I will clarify, I'm speaking on my own behalf here, not Transparency International. And so the objective back then was to get a sense of how much do we know, what does the literature say about what we, how is sextortion being discussed, is it being prosecuted, and what are the results? And so one of the key things here is the definition of sextortion, right? We have, with these type of cases, we have two options, prosecuting with the anti-corruption legal frameworks or with the gender-based violence frameworks, and each has its own advantages and disadvantages. Can I have the presentation here so we can cover the definition? So one of the key things that I found very interesting is that the reason, and the term sextortion was coined by originally by the International Women's Judges Association. Some of the judges kept hearing in different parts of the world the experiences that some people, especially women, were facing. If they wanted to go visit a relative in a jail in Africa, for example, then they will be asked for sex to be able to bring food to the relatives. And similar experiences were being reported in Guatemala, in other sectors. So they came across this common issue and the fact that it was just, there was complete impunity. So then they basically defined sextortion as the abuse of power to obtain sexual benefit or advantage. So here the key issue is that corruption, the currency instead of money is just sex. The big difference is that when you as a public official ask for even $10, it is clear that that is a crime. But if you do the same for sex in any way, then that is more likely to be considered okay. And so that was the key thing back then. And so what they proposed was a definition that would try to allow for the anti-corruption legal framework to be used to prosecute these cases. So they proposed two components. There has to be a sexual activity. This can be something, for example, as exposing a body part, and there has to be corruption, as we just defined it. But there has to be also certain conditions. One of those is abuse of authority. There has to be a quid pro quo, and there has to be a component of psychological coercion. in which the power that this person holds is being used to make this person believe that they have to comply with this request, whether it is implicit or explicit or not. And so, because these cases oftentimes can be very, happen in gray areas, there's often confusion. One of the things that I have found often is that any type of sexual misconduct in a public service setting is often considered sextortion, but it isn't, right? One of the key points that the Women's Judges Association was saying is that this is not something that will just handle all kinds of sexual misconduct. In order for this to be an effective legal tool, it has to be very specific. So, for example, sexual harassment at work without a quid pro quo is misconduct, and it is illegal in many jurisdictions, but it is not sextortion per se, right? The other thing that I have come across a lot and that I find very problematic is the use of terms like transactional sex or sexual favors to describe this. A transaction per se is not corrupt, and the same goes for a favor. It's a very benign term, and so I think that takes the really bad nature of a corrupt act, and so I think the labels we use are important. So, as I mentioned, sextortion can be prosecuted with the two legal frameworks. The main advantage of the anti-corruption framework for this is that it can go beyond what sometimes the gender-based violence cases can, in the sense that in those cases you have to prove that the sexual act was not consensual. In the case of sextortion, just the fact that it happened as an undue benefit is enough to prove that there was corruption. And so, the other thing that can, that is useful here is that the way that many of the international anti-corruption agreements work, or the way that they define corruption, is flexible enough to allow for sextortion to be prosecuted. At the same time, there are risks, and I think this is something that can be easy to forget. And there are risks, especially for the people who are the victims of these situations. One of those risks, is that technically, if you are paying a bribe, you can be convicted too. And in some cases, in different countries, some people have been very close to being convicted because judges and prosecutors sometimes don't really understand the nuances or are not convinced that there was coercion. And coercion is, I will leave that to the lawyers, but it is very difficult to prove. Another risk that I found, and I thought that was a little bit shocking, is the anti-bribery legal framework can actually be used in some cases against the victim. So in this case, in New York in 2019, there were 2 police officers who raped a young woman who was in their custody, and they declared themselves guilty of accepting a bribe so they could avoid a jail sentence for rape. So the judge in that case said, well, if both sides did something wrong, then it kind of evens out. And so they didn't go to jail, which is, really problematic, and I think a misuse of these laws. But again, because this is such a new area in many jurisdictions, then these things happen. And I think it's important for especially people who are going to file a complaint to know that these things can happen. And then, of course, in some countries, as we know, especially women who complain about different types of sexual abuse can actually be prosecuted for just because they were victims of that. Not to bug you with these, but there are also limitations. As I said, proving coercion can be really difficult. In some countries, there was a legal study that compared about 30 countries around the world, and in about a third of those, only monetary bribes are criminalized. In many others, the laws are sufficiently flexible that you can interpret them as to be able to prosecute these types of cases. But what's interesting is that in most cases, the judges, prosecutors don't think about it because it's just not something that has been discussed in those terms. Of course, there's also difficulty reporting these cases because of social stigma, re-victimization, and so forth. So I think we all know the reasons why people often don't report. What I will say is that in corruption, there's a set of reasons. In sexual abuse, there's another set of reasons. Sextortion brings them all together. And when you add to that the fact that some of these laws are still very shaky in terms of how they have been used and a low conviction rate, and you can see why there's so much impunity on this. So one thing that I think is key, and I will close with this, is that what we found, even though there's, I think, still now no systematic collection of cases as you have for other crimes, we did find that this happens in developed and developing countries. It affects everybody, children, women, men. It affects people of different socioeconomical status. We have people, like undocumented migrants crossing borders who are often very vulnerable, but we also found, lawyers, business people who were also reporting these things. So we found it in many sectors, like basically any sector you can think of, we have found cases there. And I will just very quickly go through some of these. One thing that was very clear from many of the, anecdotal evidence we found is that for women, it's not that they will just, when they try to coerce sex with women, it's just that. They also want the money, so women have to pay more in bribery than men in many cases. We found, for example, judges who, in this case in Peru, that offered basically the custody of her child to a woman in exchange for sex. We had in cases in South Africa that were very pervasive to get jobs or promotions. We have a case in Norway of an ex-cabinet member who was basically making 3 young men who were seeking asylum believe that if they didn't do what he wanted, then they would be deported. And the list goes on. This is something that it can be found in any region in many different cases. One that sectors. One that I found very sad is this report about school children who had this sort of nickname for this, practice as sexually transmitted grades, and then you get a sense that even children face this, which obviously is very, very sad. So I'm gonna stop here and then leave recommendations for later. Thank you.
Thank you, especially for helping us to reflect 2 things that I wanted to capture from this. How complicated it is to think about it and to really begin to articulate what could be a response to try to reduce the risk of sextortion and trying to prosecute it, given all the different point that you raise in terms of the typology and the framework that we need to use to think about this. But also the other point that you mentioned has to do with the scarcity of data and information, and especially how you flag that this seems to be affecting certain certain sector, if you allow me, certain transaction. And this actually set the stage for the work that our colleague Otrum has done, where I would like you actually to share with us your experience and work, because you have collected data and you focus especially on sextortion in specific sector. And this has actually made it become very much clear all the problem that we face when we tried to address sextortion using traditional approach used for corruption. Please, thank you, Ortrum.
Thank you very much. I actually want to take one step back and look at the definitions again, right? So we've kind of managed to get sextortion on the stage. We see it here. There's 2 panels at the conference this year focusing on sextortion in some way. So that's a huge success, right, from a few years ago. So now we've entered the stage of discussing how do we actually want to call it, right? There's been a lot of criticism about using sextortion. One, because in some jurisdictions it's used for a different concept. So this is basically sexual blackmail online. The other thing, and there's a very nice blog that I can recommend. It's on the U4 blog that's recently been published. The question is sextortion not way too narrow, right? Is it only about sexual extortion, but what about other forms of corruption and sexual bribery, right? So there's a big discussion. Should we call it sextortion? Should we call it sexual corruption? So I just want to kind of throw that in the room, that's something that we need to discuss moving forward, and we shouldn't think about it too narrowly. That being said, my research has focused kind of on a very traditional understanding of sextortion, looking at vulnerable populations that were extorted for sex, right? We've done primary data collection, qualitative data mostly on migrants and in the WASH sector. So I just want to kind of reflect a little bit on the things we found there. So for migrants, we've looked mostly at migrants coming from sub-Saharan African countries to Europe and from all over Africa to South Africa. Those were the kind of case studies we've done. The findings are, I always say, they're not surprising. Like if we think about it, it's not surprising that you know, there's lots of sextortion at border crossings, for example, in refugee camps, in any setting where a migrant needs help, right? And of course, particularly irregular migrants are affected because they're the most vulnerable. They usually don't have any other resources. They're far away from their home networks. So they can't rely on their own network to get the help they need. So those are the typical things that we find. And they're not surprising, yet they're still understudied, so it's important to kind of put data to it. We do find that women are kind of disproportionately experiencing this form of corruption, but they're not the only ones, right? So we unfortunately, we didn't get enough kind of data, but the kind of suggestions that we hear in between the lines is that men and boys are equally, they also experience it a lot, especially young boys seem to be a big target group for sextortion. So this is where we just need more data, but it's important to think about. What in terms of definition I think is important is that we heard story after story after story where you know, we think about sextortion as kind of a, you know, the woman or the man who is involved is paying for their own whatever the border crossing, for example. But what we saw is that we also have women, you know, in a convoy, a woman is used to pay for an entire convoy, right? So how do we then kind of put that into a definition of sextortion? So reading some of the definitions that are coming out, these cases would be hard to classify. So that's something that to keep in mind, because I wouldn't be surprised if we also find this in other areas, right? That maybe, you know, men use a prostitute to pay for, you know, what they want. Does that fall under sextortion or not, right? So there's a lot of, I would say, gray area that we've decided that this is an important topic that we need to tackle and see how it fits in. What kind of as underlying factors, it's again very obvious. It's the irregular status that makes people especially vulnerable. People with a disability have been especially vulnerable, minorities and LGBTQ. So we heard a lot about like kind of effeminate presenting men being more likely to be a target for sextortion. Again, this is all not surprising when we think about it, but you know, having the evidence is important. And of course, for migrants, and Hazel already hinted at it, it's not just a vulnerability because they're regular, but it's also the fact that they're on the move, right? So how do we have reporting mechanisms when people cross the border? So they're in another country, but they might have to report the border guard of the country they just left. So it's not just the irregularity that already makes them vulnerable and less likely to report because they're afraid of the police or whoever is they're reporting to, but it's also that they're on the move, so they might only be able to report like in another country already. So that's another thing that's difficult. Another set of studies that we've done is looking at the water and sanitation and hygiene sector. We did a study in Bangladesh, or analyzed a study in Bangladesh with the Water Integrity Network, and there it was also very clear that sextortion is quite rampant. But what was really interesting, I think, about this study is that we found that so there were questions about kind of sexual violence in general and abuse, and specifically on sextortion. And we did find that there was a difference, right? So sexual violence in general occurred in all the regions that the data was collected in, kind of on the same level. Sextortion only occurred at much higher levels in areas that were water insecure, right? So that really tells us that it's not as easy to say as that all the factors that lead to sexual violence being an issue also lead to sextortion, right? So there seem to be difference. So I think that's one of the high kind of most interesting findings from this study, that the water insecurity was what really led to sextortion being more problematic. And another study also with the Water Integrity Network, we just finished and we're just analyzing the data, so we're still kind of in the analysis stage, but is in Mexico. And what was interesting there is when we asked people, you know, do you think we will find something? People were like, yeah, you'll definitely find something. So we did the first, so in Mexico City, first data collection, a survey, and we found 0 cases of sextortion. And also the local researchers was like, this is really strange. So then in the interviews, there was like, okay, there seems to be something, there are cases, but people didn't report it. So that was already the first thing. So then we decided, okay, for a second study location, let's take a very different location, right? And there we found more cases. Also, again, in the survey, we didn't find much, so it's probably about how we ask the questions, but in the interviews we find more. And what we sort of seem to see is that it's about, the difference is how tight-knit the networks are in the community, right? So the second study location is a location where there's more internal migrants, it's a less tightened community, it's while the other location is kind of, generations of families have always lived there, it's very tight-knit. And it seems that in the less tight-knit community, sextortion occurs more, which again, for me, it makes sense because, people dare to sextort more because they know that the network is not there to protect, or it's not, the people won't say, oh, I'm saying he because that's the most of the perpetrators, right? He's a bad guy. Don't go there. Go to this person that is not asking for sex. So there seems to be something, but again, we're still analyzing the data, so it will take a bit. But that's kind of one of our first findings.
Thank you. I was actually taking notes because you raised a very important point in your conversation, that yesterday I was sitting in a panel about measuring corruption. And Ortrud just reminded us, like Hazel had done before, but Ortrud actually gave us the example that not only we need to think differently about sextortion as a phenomenon, but also how we collect data on sextortion. Because the tools that we have been using might actually not get us to the true extent of this phenomenon for a variety of reasons, as Ortrud was suggesting. And so this is actually something that we will pick up again later, because it's very important to me. Because unfortunately, if we don't have an understanding of the phenomenon, we don't have information and data on this, it's going to be hard to actually then take action. And so thank you. And thank you also for the reflection of the difference mechanism that happened depending on where you looked at it, if it was inside the water sector, if it was inside the education, because that also makes me reflect on how important it is to really tailor a response and a preventive action that really understand the context of not just at the country level, but really of what is happening and what is the need that they are trying to respond to. Now, Claudia, you have been working with your team for a while on this topic, and the Basel Institute has been actually focusing on this. Can you share with us some of the work that has been done and some of the most interesting finding that you have had over the past few years collecting information and data on this? Thank you.
Sure. So first of all, thank you for organizing this panel and inviting me. I agree, it's great that finally this topic is getting visibility. You know, in my case, I don't necessarily come from a gender angle. I've been working in this field of anti-corruption for the past 15 years or so, doing research and providing technical assistance, and my focus has always been on trying to understand, okay, so what are the local drivers, understandings, and, you know, incentives that motivate people to engage in corruption. And I have to say that sextortion is a topic that I didn't look for. It jumped in my face, literally, out of conducting this research. So I think the first time I really encountered it face to face was when we were conducting research in East Africa, looking at behavioral determinants of petty corruption in health and education. And we were doing a comparative study in Rwanda, Tanzania, and Uganda. And in the course of this study, the fact that people were using sex as a currency to, you know, in the setting of provision of health services, in the setting of education, it became clear to me this is an issue. It wasn't even in my radar, to be honest, but just from speaking to the local people, it became clear that this is a massive problem. And since then, it's like one of those instances where once you've seen something, you cannot unsee it, and it's just popping out everywhere where we're doing work, where there are conditions of scarce resources, of weak governance. Seems like sextortion is there. So I think that, you know, it's really important for us to be aware that this is a topic we're really only starting to scratch the surface. We're looking at the tip of the iceberg. And part of the reason is because of the nature of the problem. It's shrouded in secrecy. So for people to come out and accept that this is an issue they are confronted with, it's not as easy as, well, report the bribe you paid. Right? And, you know, what you were saying about Mexico, I come from Mexico, I grew up in Mexico City, and I can tell you from first-hand experience, sexual violence is there, very much so. And the fact that you found no reportings, or very few reportings, to me what it says is we really have to understand the context. Like in the case of Mexico, unfortunately, we have a very severe issue of violence against women. You know, the rate of feminicides in Mexico is just absolutely shocking. So to me, if you understand that this is the context where people are coming from, it is not surprising that people are not reporting. You know, you risk your life, you risk, you know, your personal physical safety if you report. So we need to develop tailored mechanisms. It's not just your average petty corruption that we're talking about here. It really has a much deeper social and you know, we're talking about issues of shame, stigma, blame, and so on. In terms of more concrete work that we've been doing at the Institute, we have been focusing on sextortion in institutions of higher education. This came out quite strongly in our work in Tanzania, where we were already seeing this, the indications that this was a problem. But then we work very closely with the Tanzanian Anti-Corruption Authority, the PCCB. We help them building capacity with trainings and so on. And in the course of one of these trainings, we were discussing, you know, what collaborations could come. And they said, hey, we've done the research and we are so shocked and so worried that in our public universities, sextortion is an epidemic. So we're working now with the University of Dar es Salaam, with the PCCB, of course. How can we tackle this problem? And I can speak later. I think we'll have an opportunity to speak about more the details of what can be done. But in the meantime, interestingly enough, in the course of another program we're engaged in this case in Indonesia, where we have a USAID-funded program called Integritas, where sextortion again came up, and again in public universities. So in the case of Indonesia, we're working with the University of Medan, helping them develop a program to address extortion in their institution. And there, my colleague Jude Schoenberg and I, we traveled to Indonesia earlier this year, and we had first meetings at the university. And it was, in a way, really encouraging to see how so many students showed up and really were very interested to hear and to understand what can be done. But also, it was very interesting to see how confused people still are as to what does it mean when we speak about sextortion. So some people were like, well, but what if it's consensual? I mean, maybe, the student is into it. And so there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of building awareness and really helping people understand that where there are power asymmetries, this is not correct, and not just because of conflict of interest. This goes beyond that, and yeah, in terms of the definition, people were even asking, so is it sextortion if I know a story of a guy who paid a bribe by bringing prostitutes to the bribe receiver? So is this sextortion? So it is a very strange and nasty multi-dimensional creature that we're looking at. I think that it's really good we're starting to have these conversations, and it's good, Hazel, you brought the legal angle. And I know that Monica Kiria from U4 is with the ONCAC working group conducting a mapping exercise, right, to look across different countries what is the status of legislation in this field. I'm very happy also to hear about your work with migration, with the water sector. On our side, we're also working with a London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and in their work they have also found sextortion to be quite an issue in health. So I think that, to me, what I will end this first intervention with is that it's encouraging that we're starting to get the pieces of the puzzle together. And we definitely need many different perspectives and many different lenses to look at this problem to start turning it, deconstructing it and finding solutions.
Thank you. Thank you also for reminding us how important it is to really look at this problem from different point of view, and to really have a conversation, a little bit what Hazel was suggesting at the beginning, because there are, it is a challenging issue, depending if you look at through, as I also am an anti-corruption expert, I'm not a gender-based violence, I don't use that framework. And now instead we needed to reconcile the two different points of view to have a better understanding of the problem. I know we were trying to squeeze a lot into this panel, because I will go back and ask them more questions on what our three panelists already discussed, but we wanted also to start to reflect in the 90 minutes that we had on what could be potentially some of the initial recommendations that they are emerging based on their work. So exactly because of what all three have emphasized, you cannot, because it's not a traditional form of corruption, to use traditional policy responses and intervention that they're used for other form of corruption might not benefit, might not reduce the risk, might not protect the victim, might not help in any form. So what were the initial recommendations that emerged from the work that you did? Thanks.
Yes. So I think starting with the legal aspect, one of the key things I think that comes from all of us here is that there needs to be more clarity about how this is going to be prosecuted. As last I heard, and I'm happy to hear about new cross-country comparison about, how these can work. But as far as I know, there isn't anywhere like a model legal framework that can be really used. And what I have seen, at least from different studies, is that the conviction rates are very low, and even when there have been some convictions, they are often, appeal and reversed. There is something that is still quite not clicking on this. So while, it is a good idea to prosecute these kinds of situations as corruption, I don't think we have legally the precise formula yet. So I think, before saying, yes, this is the right way to do it, let's see if we can legally do it, because the fact that it's so hard everywhere, I think has to do with some of these cultural issues. But I think also we do have to play with, legal systems and rule of law. And there is the other issue of the fact that corruption is a very hard, crime to prove. And then you have the sexual aspect of it, that's also a really hard area to prove. So they just come together. So in a way, when you're trying to put them together, you may be, in some cases, giving yourself more work. And that's something that, speaking with lawyers, they're very aware of. And when you need maybe, and that's what I hear from a lot of lawyers, is just having more tools in the box, so that depending on the situation you have, the level, the kinds of proof that you have, then you can decide which one is more, likely to help you get there. The other thing that, is obviously very important, we have laws, but at the end of the day, how they're interpreted can make all the difference in the world. So I think the awareness raising is key. Just not just the fact that, even when the laws allow prosecuting this as corruption, it doesn't occur to people a lot of the times, is one thing. But then when we go, and that gets us into the next point of the reporting mechanisms, there is the issue also that oftentimes when somebody wants to, report one of these cases, they don't necessarily know how to articulate it. This is a sextortion case because this happened to me. And even if they describe it in a really clear way, that doesn't mean that the person who receives the complaint will necessarily understand it that way, and they may be, no, you need to go to the corruption office, or the other way around, no, you need to go to the sexual harassment, and they will be going back and forth. So there needs to be a lot more awareness. And also there needs to, I think with the whole Me Too thing in the last few years, this has improved, but it is not necessarily fixed, as we all know. When people talk about this, in many cases, it is still seen as, well, that's, just something you have to deal with, or it's not such a big deal. It's definitely not criminal. So there is a lot of work to do there. There's also the issue of whether the mechanisms even exist, the biases of the people who work there, just on their own, and also the reality that I think sometimes people who work on corruption, like we try to just say that this has to be reported, but we also have to understand that for a lot of these people, in addition to what Orton was saying, when people are migrating, where are they going to go? And also they're not in a legal situation. But even in regular situations, people are busy. A lot of these, very vulnerable women, for example, to go to some office and report something, they have to take time off work and find somebody to look after the children, and they have to pay to get there. And they don't necessarily, get any, benefit that, and I don't want to say benefit, but just something that will pay, compensate the cost that this is having for them. And then I would say they also have to be warned about the risk that they will, assume by filing some of these complaints. And then I think Ortrum discussed this a little bit already, but on data and research, I think the key thing is that, we often don't ask the right questions. I think what you were saying about how this topic jump at you, I think that has been doing for a while, but I don't think necessarily everybody would see it and say, oh yes, this needs to be addressed. I think, some people are maybe, or don't have the time, or it's not a priority for them, the same way that the topic hasn't been a priority for a long time in anti-corruption agendas. So I think that's an area where that there needs to be also awareness just among researchers. And then categorizing things. Unfortunately, this is a situation where you don't have, this is a sextortion case. This is, in many cases you have a, like a convergence of, illegal behaviors, and you can classify them in different ways. And, sometimes they're just not the right way, but what the right way depends on what you're studying or what you're doing. And so it is very complex, and I think the best thing we can do is just have these conversations like we are here and papers, and just, just test and see what can work better. And maybe the other thing I would say to, I can keep going on, but what I would say about the sectoral level, definitely very important to try to look, I think what you both are mentioning, just looking inside about what the patterns are and the incentives and disincentives. I think that's very important. But it's a huge task, right? Because it changes from not just it's a sector thing, but it's also a context of the place where you are, and it will also vary a lot. So I don't think we can expect to have this is the final definite catalog of sextortion cases. But I do think it is very important to just get as much information as we can. And then the last thing I will say, there are a lot of things that corruption experts have that can really help to, on the sexual-based violence and vice versa. And I think there definitely needs to be, a lot of work that, just coordination is sharing knowledge and at the research level, but also at the, legal level as well. Otherwise, I think both sides are going to be just, relearning what has already been learned in the past. And so I think that's also important.
Thank you. I really like this idea of finding a way to actually, rephrase what you say, bridging the two community of work and integrated together, because I think that actually this is what made me reflect and realize how little I understood of the phenomena, starting to read more and more and getting deeper into this work. Ortrum, based on your work, some of the initial recommendation that you could share with us, what can we push everybody, what can we share with our audience so we actually start to make some step forward?
Thank you. Well, I think Hazel already covered a lot of ground, but picking up on the last point of learning from kind of what has been done for decades in sexual and gender-based violence, research, advocacy, policy, is to take an actual gender angle, right? And this means not just men, women, but also including LGBTQI issues. That's a general problem in gender and corruption research, right? That's not covered enough, but it's particularly when we look at sexual corruption, sextortion, however we end up calling it, that really has been ignored. So I don't know of any studies who particularly look at or include a focus on how LGBTQI individuals experience sextortion, and that's a huge issue, of course, because we know from sexual and gender-based violence, we know that they face additional risks, right, because of their sexual identity and gender identity. So we would expect this to also be the case for corruption, right? So that's one thing. And when we focus on this gender angle, and I know that's a kind of an uncomfortable and difficult thing to do, but it's also about thinking about underlying systems, right? So we cannot address this issue without looking at issues of patriarchy, who is in power, who is not, racial discrimination. All of these issues are so closely linked to sextortion that we cannot address it without looking at these. And I know, from corruption research, people like to stay away from it because it's difficult and it's uncomfortable, and it's also difficult to sell to policymakers, right? It's easier to say, if you do this, then you can save money, than it is to say, hey, you need to change how you are looking at the role of women in your society, right? That's a much more long-term and a much more difficult and thing to sell. So I understand why it is uncomfortable, but if we want to address sextortion, it's impossible to not address these issues. And just to give an example from our migrant research, it was very clear that kind of the over-sexualization of Black women led to an additional danger for them in terms of sextortion. So we had a lot of cases from it was Italy, but I'm sure it occurs in other places as well, where the women were saying, well, because we're black, the police officers assumed we like it and we want it, and so there is this racial element, for example, right? So there are lots of these factors that we need to think about, and again, we know this from people who are doing gender-based, who are researching gender-based and sexual violence. They've said this for decades, but we need to incorporate this into corruption as well. And the last point is, I say, and I do this myself. I focus mostly on kind of the most vulnerable populations, right? People living in poverty, migrants, irregular migrants. But we should also, and we need to focus, of course, on those populations is important, but we should also not ignore that this is also happening at kind of levels where we expect people to have a lot of power, right? So, for example, we know that women in politics face lots of obstacles. I'm pretty sure sextortion is one of it for many of them, but we don't have the data yet. So we should also focus on kind of the highest level of power where we expect people to have power to say no. And they cannot, right? So just to get a whole picture. So when we do research, I think that's another angle that would be interesting to look at, not just researching the most vulnerable populations, but kind of society as a whole.
Thank you. I'm frantically taking notes because you're giving me so many ideas on what I might want to do going forward. And I particularly appreciated your comments about the importance of not just focusing on what might be obvious, but break out of our own frame of mind and really look at this problem in a very integrative way. Claudia, how would you, any recommendation for our work going forward based on what you have done both in Indonesia, in Tanzania, and Rwanda?
Yes, thank you. So I mean, again, just to underscore, I think it's important that we have a holistic approach. I think it's important, the work you're doing, Hazel, and other colleagues, to really look from the legal perspective, how we can properly criminalize this and how to make it a prosecutable crime. This is hugely important. On my side of things, I've always been interested at looking at how we can decrease the enforcement gap, right? Because where I come from in the anti-corruption world, I mean, it was said yesterday many times, there are good laws, they are not enforced. That's the issue. So I'm always interested to see how we can look at local context and understand the motivations, incentives, and see how we can steer and help shift attitudes and behaviors so that we can close the gap. So, I mean, to start from the beginning, I agree that we need to find good ways to measure the extent of the problem. In that regard, in my team, we are working on developing a survey instrument that we are going to be piloting soon in Indonesia, and it's a really tricky thing because how do you get people to be honest about such topics that are so taboo and so embarrassing and so horrible for those who need to report? So I don't have any findings yet, but I can tell you the way that we are approaching it, we're trying to be innovative. We are using survey experiments. There are ways where you can ask questions without really asking the question. So, for example, one of the things we're piloting in Indonesia is for this survey, you divide the survey respondents into two groups, and you have a question, a pretty innocent question. Group 1 gets asked, of the next 4 actions, say how many you have engaged with in the past year, for example. And these are very, innocuous. I asked my supervisor for feedback on my essay, or I went for lunch with my colleagues, whatever. But then there's the second group in the sample, and they get the same question, except they also get in that list, I was asked for a sexual favor by faculty, for example, something like this. And then through statistical methods, which I'm not the expert, but my colleague Jude in my team is, then you can estimate the prevalence of this sextortion answer from the answers of your control group. So anyway, I mean, this is all to say that I think we need to get creative on how we measure, we develop tools to measure the problem. So this is one thing. The other thing is, I mean, we really, like Ortum said, we need to understand the social systems and the social context in which these behaviors are happening. And we really need to address the social acceptability that this, that unfortunately sexual violence has in some context. And I think that, I mean, let's be realistic. We're not going to overthrow a patriarchy, overnight. My 2 cents is I think we need to be very strategic, and we need to be focalized, looking at sectors, looking at populations where we should be prioritizing, and where we can hopefully make a difference, even if we start small. I mean, I think that small has the potential to grow bigger, no? And in this regard, I think that we need to test as well what can work. I don't think that we can necessarily know that beforehand. So we have, in my team, we have a few ideas of what we can try. I mean, one of the things that I'm really keen on is developing pilots and actually testing things in the field with the real stakeholders. We've done this kind of work in the scope of our GIA's funded project, where we ran an intervention to address social norms of bribery in a Tanzanian hospital, and we got some good results. So what we're thinking in terms of addressing sextortion in the Indonesian university and in the Tanzanian university, the good news is that the management is on board. They want to do something about this program. They want to raise awareness amongst the faculty and staff that this is absolutely not a no-go to engage in this kind of behaviors. So what we're saying is, well, what if we latch on, to whatever training and awareness raising activities that are going to go ahead anyways? Why don't we ask participants to sign a pledge? And then those go on the wall. So that, you make a visible change in the environment where you have a physical signal, that can help. I mean, we saw this in the Tanzanian hospital pilot, that just having posters and desk signs that people could point to really helped, for those who want to resist, to have something to say, hey, there's an institutional position towards this, and this shouldn't be happening. So something like this, I think that provides those who need the resources to resist in the moment, those should be there somehow. And the other thing which was successful in our Tanzania hospital experiment was working with social networks and actually peer-led approaches. And I think this is very important in the case of sextortion, because it's not just about, in our bribery intervention, it was about spreading the message about anti-bribery. In this case, it's much more than that. It would be really about building networks of support and building social networks that can help bring this topic out of the shadow. I think that this has to become part of the conversation so that then victims can feel more supported and more secure in coming out, because it's a social thing in the end, whether, you know, this is acceptable or not.
Thank you. This is actually very comprehensive and thoughtful. We were very good. I appreciate it because we discussed it. We wanted to have half an hour for a question and answer, and then I want to save 2 minutes for another colleague that is going to share something with us. So our panelists have been very good at managing time. So we have half an hour. I know there is a mic that will be circulating. I already see hands going up. Please be brief and introduce yourself so then we can actually give the opportunity to everybody. Let's start here in the front. Let's collect a few questions. So I see already 4. Please.
Hi, Valeska Onken from GIZ in South Africa, and my colleague here, we're going to combine our questions because they're probably quite similar. I thank you so much. These were really excellent insights. And one thing that struck me is, this importance of interdisciplinary collaboration on this, because I think there's a lot that can be done unintentionally and will cause harm. Mm-hmm. And we've been grappling with the issue in the context of South Africa, where there is also shocking levels of femicide. And when we use these terms, we sometimes forget that behind that is real suffering of people, all the way to being killed. And there's ample documentation of that. And so we have to be very, very careful on how to even raise awareness about it. We did an awareness-raising campaign where at the end we were sort of at the last slide on where to report. And we were discussing it for forever, because the only thing we could come up with is go to TI, or our chapter is Corruption Watch in South Africa, who would only take it for statistical purposes, which has a value, but it won't help the person reporting at all. And then you actually might make them more vulnerable. So there's another thought that I wanted to share, which is, shouldn't we also look at human rights legislation and the human rights litigation, because not at the higher level. I get there are different phenomena within the topic of sexual corruption, but in the context of South Africa, a lot of it is actually access to human rights. You talked about health, education. In the context of protection of migrants, this is really touching the human rights of the people who are then sexually abused, and they cannot go to any court with this, because if they go for sexual harassment, then it's said, but it's quid pro quo. You got something for it, so there was consent. You cannot. And if they go for corruption, it's said that then both parties are liable. So they're stuck between the two. And I think the human rights angle might also help solving that issue, especially legally. So it's another discipline that might need to be looked at.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
Tobile Madonsela with Valeska, GIZ South Africa. And my question, and maybe it is an unfair question right now, but what is the protections what does the panel think we can start protecting the victims of sextortion? Because with sextortion, it's damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you don't sort of undergo the pressure, and then you still don't get what you need, and you get ostracized because you did not partake in the sexual act. Or you partake in the sexual act, and then along the line you decide you don't want to, then you're still victimized and ostracized. So from the panel's perspective, in terms of protection, where can we start with that? Because we have vulnerable people, damned if you did, do damned if you don't, and where do they go, and how should they be protected? I think that would be my question. Thanks.
Thank you. I see a hands here, and then there was a hands there, and yes.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the panel for the very interesting perspectives. Just to start from what the last speaker said, how do we protect the victims? In fact, our workshop on sextortion on Friday is from the victim's perspective, and we have a number of suggestions, including anonymous reporting. Now, what I have heard here this morning is, let me comment first on the issue of definition. And my sense is that eventually we may have to strive away from defining sextortion and go the way of the anti-corruption conventions that describe what constitutes sextortion. Because if we define, we stand the risk of limiting the scope and burying some of the aspects. I also heard from one of the panelists, sexual harassment without a quid pro quo. And this is a will not be sextortion. This is a statement I do not agree with. Even when there's no immediate quid pro quo, if there's power asymmetry, it could form part of sextortion. For instance, in the office setting, somebody who is higher up has nothing to offer you in the immediate, but there's that prospect in the future. And once there's that power asymmetry, it could form sextortion. Just to quickly give an example of how sextortion has been successfully prosecuted in Nigeria. I should have started by introducing myself. I have multiple identities. A member of the International Federation of Women Lawyers, with whom we are proposing this workshop, UNODC in Nigeria, and also Transparency International. Nigeria has successfully prosecuted some sextortion cases, both from the gender violence angle and also from the anti-corruption angle. In fact, the anti-corruption agency prosecuting sextortion cases in Nigeria will be part of the panel to give examples. They are prosecuting from the point of view of abuse of power and the code of conduct for public officers. This offers some protection to the victims, because if it is a simple case of bribery, if you give, you're guilty. If you receive, if you offer, you're guilty. If you receive, you're guilty. But when it is an abuse of power, it's only the public officer, in this case, the lecturers in the university, who have responsibility. So even if it is offered, you have a duty to refuse, because you should not abuse your power. And it is from that angle that they have successfully prosecuted some of those cases. But the major problem is underreporting, like the colleague here had said earlier on. The Anti-Corruption Agency describes it as an epidemic in higher institutions. A few cases filter out and are investigated, but majority of the cases are not reported, because the victims, when they report, get re-victimized in the environment where they are. In fact, I know the case of a university lecturer, a lady, who discouraged her daughter from reporting a sextortion case because of the perception in the society. Her reputation will be ruined even if she did not succumb and all that. So as part of the recommendations, we also have an NGO that has developed an app, Timby, who will be presenting at the panel to discuss the app for anonymous reporting. Let me not take so much of your time. And thank you very much. I have really learned a lot from the panel.
Thank you. Hold on a second. There is a lady that kindly had the, yes, and then we.
Good morning. Thank you very much for all your contributions. My name is Kinda Hattar. I'm the Middle East and North Africa Regional Advisor at Transparency International. We spoke a lot about academia and about a lot of the sextortion that happens within also universities and those vulnerable groups and so on. I come from a region that has a lot of conflicts, of course. It's not a very stable region. And there hasn't been many work done on sextortion in humanitarian aid, because we know, and I have worked with UNHCR and CARE International in refugee camps, where we have witnessed that aid does not go to women, especially if they are single household or they are heading the household, except if they have, if they go and have that, basically accept the behavior of the ones that hold the aid, especially if they are men in those groups and so on, in refugee camps. And many, many other cases. And this is a sector that hasn't been touched because we see that also the international organization and intergovernmental organization try to engage more in the aid distribution rather than the aid monitoring, and there aren't so many information that come out of this because they're more even vulnerable than in sort of stable communities. So that's an aspect that needs to be unfolded, and also especially that international organizations are the ones that are running the scene in that point. So it's not states, there are no legalities, sometimes no law, rule of law is not there, so justice cannot make any way. So even humanitarian aid workers are the ones that are involved in such acts. So where do we go from there? That's another layer that needs to be discussed. Another quick point is the culturalization. So I work on this topic in the MENA region, which is a taboo as in many other situations. But there has been, we tried to do with the Global Corruption Barometer in 2019, we tried to ask the question in three countries. And the first ask was very surprising to the people. But what was more surprising is that we found that it's not just hard for women to report that, but there are men who are exposed to this. And it is not, it was surprising to see that it is also against the manhood to actually come forward and report such things. So if we want to look at angles of sextortion, and I know the word gender now is not the accepted word in a lot of countries because it has a lot of other layers, but looking at all angles of groups rather than just calling them vulnerable groups, that even the groups that we don't think or we don't have them in our back mind can actually be exposed to such behavior.
Thank you. So let me see if we can take another question here. Give a moment to our panelists. Right behind you, the lady with the, yes, and then.
Hi, thank you so much. Ara Marcen, I work in the Defense and Security Program, of Transparency International. And it's not a question, it's a appeal. We are looking into this topic. We are looking at the topic as it relates to the militaries, the armed forces, the peacekeepers, and the security forces. So as we are starting this thought piece, we had the thinking process with lots of academics, lots of think tanks, but we would like the practitioners, the people with the access to those who have lived experiences, law enforcement, like if you can reach out to us and help us, because often humanitarian, all the topics that you're talking about are really, really important, but if you add the layer of the secrecy of the militaries and that who also have the sole use, lawful use of force, it's just the scale of it and the intensity and the harm is bigger. So help us. So
thank you. Very important point. The gentleman here, and yes, both. I want to have both of them, and then yes.
Thank you. My name's Jim Fitzgerald. I'm director of the Equal Rights Trust. We've been working with Transparency International for the last 4 years to look at the links between discrimination and corruption and defining what is meant by discriminatory corruption. We're much earlier in that process, I think, than the work that's been done on sextortion, but we're facing many of the same challenges in terms of definition, in terms of understanding. But the particular point I wanted to pick up on was the one made by Hazel around these different frameworks and their approach to sanction and remedy. So for anti-discrimination lawyers, our legal frameworks are fundamentally remedial. They're about providing remedy for victims, for people who have experienced harm. Whereas obviously anti-corruption frameworks are primarily punitive, and they're about criminalizing illegal behaviors. And I think we have to find a way, as Hazel was saying, of assessing and quantifying the harm for the individual who is the victim of sextortion or discriminatory corruption. I guess the question is, on a really practical level, how is that done? Where do we bring those legal experts together? What's the forum? And what are your thoughts around kind of practically, how do we start that work around coming up with novel mechanisms of sanction that recognize these power asymmetries? Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman here, and then yes, here. And then we have to give some time to our panelists.
Good morning. My name is Apollinaire Mpiganya. I'm the Executive Director, Transparency International Rwanda. I was very interested by the topic because this is a topic of high importance. TR Rwanda, when I joined in 2008, I was motivated to fight corruption in its usual form. We know bribery, favoritism, and so forth. But as Claudia mentioned, in practice, I was hearing that there are other forms of corruption, including, at that time, we used to call it gender-based corruption. And in 2010, it's where we initiated the first research of this kind. And when we conducted interview, focus group discussions, key informants, and of course, data collection in the traditional way of research, we found that almost all Rwandans said, at that time, I used the gender-based corruption does exist. So it was really findings that opened the discussions at the national level. And in 2010, we conducted, the focus was in sexual corruption at the working place, in public, private, and civil society institution. And as Claudia said, we focused our intervention on working place. And later on, we conducted another edition in 2018. In 2022, now we are about to conduct another session, another edition, with collaboration with the GIZ in Rwanda. So what emerged from those initiatives? First and foremost, it has been a reform, the anti-corruption law. Rwandan anti-corruption law consider sexual favors as one form of corruption. They call it sexual favors. And of course, it needs to include power holder, and of course, victim. So to conclude, I think this is a broad theme that needs to be discussed in its multiple dimension. We could look to the victim who is victim of sexual favors, but there are other indirect victims, the families. If it is at the workplace, the other staff, they are as well victims. If the perpetrator and the so-called victims are consentant, while there is abuse of power and undue favors, they could be from sex. So I think there is a need of broad discussion on this topic, and I'm happy to have exchanges of researchers to fine-tune our research tools, and of course keep connecting with others to find solution. But I think they are localized, as Claudia said, and of course based on a specific community. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we have only 10 minutes, and I know that they're gonna start yelling at me if I go beyond time. So let me give it 2 minutes each, because then I wanted to have 2 minutes to close up, and let's see if we can have more, because I so many hands going up. Please.
Maybe I'll address the question on the human rights angle, and also to what extent we really need to define sextortion. I think we need both. Like when I said earlier that, when it comes to ending impunity, you do need as many tools as you can possibly have. I think in some cases, what prosecutors said, with this set of like pieces of evidence that I have with this context and this law, I can get a conviction on human rights angle potentially, and so they will go for that. In other cases, and this is where I think the whole idea of sextortion, regardless of the name, the issue that in some cases, just by having this benefit, you can prove that there was a bribe, I think is incredibly useful, and I think that's something that should be preserved, and that is working legally in different countries, even if it's not as high convictions as we would like. So I think that is very useful. What I said earlier about we cannot just expect this one law, this one crime to fix everything. That is where I think if we try to go down that route, then that's where we're not going to get any results. The other thing I will say is that sometimes when we have these words that can maybe try to mean a lot more than they can. They're not useful. I think that's what happens with sextortion. I think when it started like 20 years ago, it was very helpful because it was making visible something that didn't even have a name before, and so I think it served its role. But at the same time, we have not just a branding problem. When I say a branding problem, it sounds almost superficial, but it is. We keep talking about awareness raising, and when sextortion means something completely different for most people outside of these anti-corruption circles, then we maybe when we're talking as researchers to people and we're categorizing things in courts, then we do need to find a word that really captures the essence of this, and maybe just sexual corruption is a lot more useful. And so we're also, as a side effect of that, I think we'll not be trying to just have this one law give us the solution. So I definitely agree with both of you, and I think that's part of why this discussion needs to be broader and also care about these things, like just the labels that we use in. And then I just wanted to say, for the question that the gentleman asked, I think that's a really good question. Maybe there should be a workshop where we bring some, people and just talk about it, because I definitely think that is very interesting. Maybe in the panel on, I think, Friday about the perspective of the user, there can be some interesting discussion on that front too.
Thank you. Ortrun?
I'll keep it very short, but I think one of the important points that was raised by multiple was this focus that we remember that, this is a very specific victim group that has very specific needs, and there are mechanisms in place that can help in the short term, right? So most countries have hotlines for or NGOs that work with victims of sexual and gender-based violence, and we should encourage people who experience sextortion to also use those services, right? So that's a very, and I leave the further discussions for the panel on Friday, but I think that's something where we need to stay away from constantly trying to reinvent the wheel, right? Corruption research doesn't have to solve every problem new. Many mechanisms exist where, cooperating and saying, hey, you hotline or whatever, be aware that this is also the case, and the consequences are the same, right? The PTSD, the sexually transmitted diseases, the unwanted pregnancy, all of these things occur also in sextortion, just as in sexual and gender-based violence. So sending victims to these places where they can get help can be kind of a first step, while we're kind of debating on a grand scale how to have laws and regulations on a bigger level. So,
thank you, Claudia.
Yeah. So building up on what Ortrun said, and I'm again coming from the anti-corruption side of things. I'm not a gender violence specialist, but. Of course, the reporting mechanisms are, should be a first priority, and in many cases there are some already there. However, in my experience, in many of the countries where I work, the reporting mechanisms are there and people don't use them, even for normal or conventional types of corruption. And why is this the case? Most frequently, according to surveys and data we've seen, it's lack of trust, it's lack of belief that anything will change, but it's also fear. And I think that this elements that we see with conventional corruption are probably more than exacerbated in the case of sextortion. So I think, yes, it's really important to have the mechanisms there. It's really important to ensure anonymity, to have the spaces where the victims can go. But I would underscore, we also need to tackle the social acceptability and the social issues around this topic, because if, like, as the colleague said, if people are encouraging the victims to not report because of stigma, we have a big social issue to tackle, and it's about bringing this topic out of the shadow, taking the social acceptability out of it, and we know that it's possible, right? I mean, there are so many topics that we now speak in the open that were taboo not too long ago, so I think we're on our way. We just need to be strategic and focus our efforts. I love your approach with working with the vulnerable populations, so yeah.
Thank you. Before we close, I actually wanted to introduce our colleague Anna Petrick, that is an associate professor and has, I'm going to abuse my role as a moderator, simply because I wanted her to share some of the initiative and idea that she's doing in this area. 2 minutes, and then we have one.
So thank you very much, and I just wanted to say thank you to the fantastic panel and to you guys. I've studied gender and corruption as a researcher for 12 years, and every year the rooms get fuller and fuller, and it's wonderful to see. So I really have 2 things to say. The first is to invite you to an informal lunch discussion today. There isn't really a good space for it, but I'm going to do my best to grab a table in the lunch area and spread my belongings. And in this informal discussion, to take forward some of the conversation about appropriate policy making. And the other thing I want to do is to make you aware of a resource. So myself, a professor in Sweden called Monica Bohr, and the head of, he recently ended his term, but the head of Nigeria's anti-corruption agency wrote a paper about the emerging policy approaches in sexual corruption. And what is, I guess, particular about this paper is that it was discussed and developed in a group of 12 national heads of anti-corruption agencies, including auditor generals, over a series of different periods of time. And the paper really highlights a few particular areas of policy discussion by comparing Brazil and Nigeria. And those areas are really thinking about what we call active corruption, so the offering or provision of a bribe. Now, UNCAC requires state parties to criminalize this. And what I would like to do is develop guidance for the interpretation and implementation of UNCAC in this area. And there's actually a law in Brazil that's through the lower house, but not through the upper house, in contradiction of this. So the victim, if you like, cannot be prosecuted. The second thing is to discuss supporting policy. So what Ortrun was talking about in particular. Nigeria hasn't changed its law. There's no real new law. But the head of Nigeria's anti-corruption agency has retrained prosecutors and created special sexual offences courts that deal with sexual corruption. And the third area for discussion, I think, is how to handle third-party sexual corruption, which Ortrun briefly mentioned. And this is really going to different questions of consent. So this is where someone hires a prostitute who is providing the sexual favors or services that are part of the bribe. And that probably requires a very different legal framework to deal with. Anyhow, I invite you, if you want to get access to this paper, you can download it. I have, along with 12 papers from the Chandler sessions, which have all been discussed among this group of 12 national heads of anti-corruption, and to come to lunch and talk about these issues. So, thank you.
Thank you. So as you can see, I think that someone mentioned, maybe Claudia, it's really a community of people interested in this topic that is growing more and more. And I'm very grateful for the interest and the reaction. I know I couldn't give the floor to everybody that wanted to comment, and other people have come up to me already asking me to be able to provide additional thoughts and comments. I will stay here beyond the time. I know our speaker also, I wanted to thank them for sharing to join in the panel. They will make themselves available. I hope that we can continue this conversation. That is only just the beginning, and I'm very glad that there are other sessions that will pick up on this. And please, thank you for your patience, and let's continue this conversation not just in this context, but bilaterally, so we can actually make some progress. Thank you so much.